and welcome everybody to this webinar on the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. We have a couple of folks on the line from our South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative. We have Rua Mordecai, Hillary Morris, and Mallory Martin who have joined us to talk to us today about the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. I'd like to turn the speaking over to them at this point in time. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. So this is Hillary. I work on Blueprint user support and communications for the South Atlantic LCC, which means that I work with folks who are using the Conservation Blueprint in their work, and I also do a lot of our communications, things like newsletter, webinar series, that sort of thing. And Rua is also going to be doing part of the presentation today. Rua?
Hi, everybody. I'm the science coordinator for your cooperative here in the South Atlantic.
So thanks so much for joining us today. We're really happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about the primary thing that we work on, which is the Conservation Blueprint. So I'll start out by introducing what the South Atlantic LCC is. I'll talk about the 3 steps that we've used to develop the blueprint, and I'll highlight the current version of our blueprint, Blueprint 2.1, and then follow up with my favorite part, which is talking about how folks are using the blueprint in their decision making. So what is the South Atlantic LCC? It's really a forum for a diverse set of partners across the private, nonprofit, and public sectors to come together and decide what we want the conservation future of the South Atlantic region to look like, and then work together to make that vision a reality. So LCCs really emerged out of this growing recognition in the conservation community that the challenges we face, things like climate change, urbanization, water scarcity, invasive species, these are too big for any one organization to address alone, and we need to work together as partners to develop solutions. So obviously addressing those types of changes is a tall order, but the South Atlantic LCC is not working on that alone. We're part of a network of 22 LCCs across the country and into Mexico and Canada. The South Atlantic LCC is number 14 on this big map, so you can see that we cover parts of 6 states from southern Virginia into northern Florida, and we do go 200 miles offshore as well. We're really committed to looking at the connections between terrestrial and aquatic systems, and we did go ahead and embrace the open ocean as part of our geography, so we work on a lot of marine issues. We also work with partners in the large landscape conservation and climate adaptation realm, like the Southeast Climate Science Center, the Carolina Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, and the Southeast Regional Climate Hub. So the South Atlantic LCC is governed by a steering committee. So each of these folks that you see represented here by their logos really have an equal role in charting the strategic direction of your cooperative and making decisions about governance. I want to briefly just put some faces to names for you, introduce you to the staff. Mallory Martin's our coordinator. You just heard from Rua, our science coordinator. Amy Keister is our GIS coordinator. That's me, Hillary, in the bottom left. My colleague Louise is the other half of the Blueprint user support team. And then we also have Janet Shakir, who works on climate adaptation and cultural resources. So what does the South Atlantic LCC do? Well, our mission is to facilitate conservation actions that sustain natural and cultural resources guided by a shared adaptive blueprint. And that blueprint has taken the form of a living spatial plan that prioritizes opportunities for shared conservation action, opportunities that are going to help us protect those resources that we care about in a changing future. So how's the blueprint being used? I often think of this as a spectrum from where in someone's decision process they're integrating the blueprint. So one way that we've had a lot of success with the blueprint being used so far is to amplify the impact of existing efforts. And by that we mean to justify the importance of the good work that folks are already doing while also showing how that work adds up to something more meaningful at the landscape scale. And so far, this has been a really effective way for people to bring that landscape perspective to their local actions, and it's made a compelling story for funders to help compete more effectively for conservation dollars. And so one great example of this is through the Department of Interior's Wildland Fire Resilient Landscapes program. where the strong partner relationships in the South Atlantic, the indicators, and the conservation blueprint itself really helped bring almost $2 million in the first 2 years of this program alone to support prescribed burning in priority longleaf pine focus areas across the South Atlantic region. And we've heard from folks who were involved in writing this proposal and reviewing this proposal that there's a good chance this money wouldn't have come to the Southeast if it weren't for the South Atlantic LCC. So we feel really great about that. You can see from the map here that the other cooperatives that were funded through this effort are west of the Mississippi, and since it's wildfire resilience, you can maybe understand why that would be, but we're excited to have helped bring this funding to the region. And one thing that's pretty exciting about this project is that the money is going to support burning staff, support aerial training on not just public lands, but private and nonprofit lands as well, anchored around some key longleaf refuges and parks in the Southeast. And we're also using the South Atlantic ecosystem indicators to track the impact of this investment on the longleaf pine ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along. The blueprint's also being
Hillary,
used.
if I could add to that, this is Debbie. So another way that the blueprint is being used is that's actually one of the questions on the operations funding spreadsheet that they have to answer is there something that they're asking for that's going to contribute to the blueprint. So that's something that we're looking at the core as well.
Awesome. Thank you for adding that. So another way that the blueprint's being used, in addition to those two examples, is to help people anticipate and plan for change. Think about how might what I'm doing today need to change in the future that includes climate change, that includes sea level rise or urbanization. And so one way this has happened is through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NFWF. NFWF realized in the wake of Hurricane Sandy that they needed to prioritize areas for their investment in advance of the major disaster rather than waiting for the scramble for funding that happens in the aftermath. And so in response to that realization, they sponsored this rapid prioritization of fish and wildlife habitat broadly within the whole South Atlantic region and then more narrowly within the Cape Fear River watershed. And the South Atlantic LCC helped connect these partners that you see here on a successful proposal to do that. And we anchored the regional prioritization around the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint and anchored the watershed level prioritization around North Carolina Natural Heritage Program data. And then the last way the blueprint's being used, we think of this as kind of the holy grail, really using the blueprint to adapt to change through on-the-ground conservation action. And one example of this is through a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who typically focused most of his hydrologic restoration work in really pristine mountain basins. But based on the blueprint and a couple of other landscape level plans, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fisheries plan and an American Rivers dam prioritization tool, he decided to shift some of his focus to the Piedmont, where all of these plans agree that there were really great restoration opportunities for migratory fish. And so this dam removal on the Little River of North Carolina actually resulted from that decision. So now I'm going to move on to talking a little bit more about the process that we use to develop the blueprint. Step one is to decide on ecosystem indicators. These are our shared measures of success that allow us to track progress toward our goals. Then we have the state of the South Atlantic, and this is a kind of an ecosystem report card style assessment that measures and grades the current condition of each of those indicators. And then the final piece is the blueprint itself, which is our plan for shared action for how we're going to improve those scores working together. So we have about 30 different indicators. They're specific to particular ecosystems in many cases, things like estuaries, marine, upland hardwood. We also have indicators that apply more broadly to capture the connections between terrestrial and aquatic systems. All of the indicators were selected according to a set of ecological, practical, and social criteria that basically boils down to we only selected indicators we can monitor and model today using existing data, and we only selected indicators that accurately indicate for something other than themselves, so they have to track other aspects of a healthy, intact system. The natural resource indicators were selected to reflect the goal of ecosystem integrity. So this is things like riparian buffers and the upland hardwood bird index. And on the cultural resource side, we selected indicators to reflect the goal of intact cultural landscapes. So that's honing in on those places where the natural world intersects with the values that humans place on the environment, either for a site's historic or cultural significance or its recreational value, something like that. And so an example of one of our cultural resource indicators is the land use surrounding sites on the National Historic Register. All of the indicators are modeled at a 200-meter spatial scale, and they form the foundation, the data foundation for the blueprint. So then the next step is the state of the South Atlantic. What are those indicators telling us about the health of our lands and waters today? So this is an assessment that grades that condition on an ABCDF scale, just like a school report card. So overall, you see that the South Atlantic region as a whole scores a C, and then that score gets broken down in further pages by subregion and by ecosystem. And one thing I want to highlight is in the upper right-hand corner of this page that's showing the grade for forested wetlands is a little confidence bar. It looks a little bit like a cell phone signal. This was a fun idea that the designers had when putting together this report. And the idea here is that that's kind of an expert metric, a qualitative metric of how confident we are in that score. And that kind of is a microcosm of one of the guiding principles for the South Atlantic LCC, where we try to be really transparent about the limitations of the data that we have today, but we also want to use that data that we have to go ahead and start informing decisions. So that brings us to the conservation blueprint. We're on version 2.1 of the blueprint now. Actually, this just came out a couple of weeks ago, so it's the latest and greatest version. What this is doing is it's prioritizing the lands and waters of the South Atlantic based on ecological integrity, which is measured by the current condition of the indicators, and based on a connectivity analysis. So in total, the blueprint is the pink and the purple that you see here, the pink, purple, and gray, covers 50% of the landscape. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail now about how the blueprint was developed. So what we do is we combine all of the indicators that apply to a particular ecosystem, the indicators within that ecosystem, as well as the landscapes and the waterscapes and the freshwater aquatic indicators that apply, and we calculate an ecosystem integrity score. And this is as far as the state of the South Atlantic gets us. And then we need to translate those integrity scores into priorities, and we do that with a conservation planning software program called Zonation. And then we introduce connectivity as the next step, and we do that in Linkage Mapper and ArcGIS. And that's what gives us the overall priority that you see in the blueprint. So to put that another way, we spatially combine all the indicators that apply to a particular ecosystem, and that's what gives us the priority places that you see in the zonation output, and that's where we're calling for shared action in the blueprint. And in total, we've had more than 400 people from 100 different organizations actively involved in developing this plan. And Debbie, did you want to pause here and speak a little bit more toward the relevance of the blueprint to the Army Corps?
Sure, Hillary. This is Debbie, and I just wanted to make sure that our folks in planning and regulatory and operations knew about this blueprint as we consider actions, whether we're planning them or we're looking at permits for them. It's helpful for us to know what the priority action areas are in the area. In our planning process, we need to take into account what is planned or what is happening in the area. So this is a great place for folks to go to see what priority areas are in their study footprint, or if there's priority areas in a regulatory footprint, so folks know if there's something that might be planned in the near future there or is hoping to be planned. So I just am so happy to see so much participation from all over. And wanted to just mention, at the beginning you guys saw there's more than one landscape conservation cooperative that covers our areas. So if you don't see something that is for an area that you cover, there are other landscape conservation cooperatives that do cover those areas and will have similar plans. The South Atlantic is a little further along than maybe some of the others, but I think they all are working towards a blueprint if they don't have one already.
thanks, Debbie. Yeah, definitely. All the LCCs in the southeast in particular are working on some form of spatial planning, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation, talking about the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So I want to pause briefly just for questions here. This is kind of a crash course in Blueprint 101, so does anyone have any questions before we move on to how to access this data?
If you have any questions, if you could type them into the chat box, that way we'll have a record of the questions that were asked. That would be great. We'll give you guys just a minute to do that, and if we don't have anybody that submits a question, we'll move on. And I believe near the end, Hillary's going to give you some links that will help you see where you can actually visit this information live and perhaps download stuff if you are a GIS type of person.
Absolutely.
So far, I do not see any questions coming in. Please send them to everyone if you do have questions.
There's a little drop down.
Oh, there's one. Here. Where can the spatial data be located, and is there sufficient metadata to describe the data sets? There we go.
Yes, that's a perfect question. Yeah, beautiful segue. So I'm actually going to hit next slide here to pull this up. So there are two different online mapping portals where you can access the blueprint data, and you can also download the data directly into ArcGIS to use on your local machine. So one way is called the Conservation Planning Atlas, and we think of this as kind of an everyman's online alternative to GIS. You can access lots of free data. You can overlay different data sets to make maps, do some basic spatial analysis, and this is where you would go to download the underlying spatial data for the blueprint, for the indicators, for the zonation scores, for the connectivity analysis, and it's where we house all of that detailed metadata. And that actually makes me really happy because as a communications person, metadata is something that I work on a lot, and we've spent a lot of time on as a total staff in the last couple of weeks getting ready for the Blueprint 2.1 launch. So on the CPA, if you go to that link, salcc.databasin.org, it's going to take you to the Conservation Planning Atlas homepage, and there is an icon there that's going to say Access Blueprint 2.1 Data. That's going to take you to the Blueprint 2.1 Data Gallery, where you can see all of the data sets, all of the interim products in the process of developing the blueprint, and all of the spatial data as well as the documentation. And so you can download a PDF called the Blueprint 2.1 Development Process when you're in that gallery, and that's going to combine basically all the documentation about how the blueprint was developed, and you can see metadata as you click through layer by layer.
And I'll show you that when we do the live demo in just a little bit at the end here.
You can also access blueprint data on the Simple Viewer, and the Simple Viewer is currently still on version 2.0, so there is a little message you'll see that, hey, there's a more recent version of the blueprint, and we think the Simple Viewer is going to be updated really soon. We're just working through some contracting challenges right now. But what the Simple Viewer is intended to be is the simple version of the viewer. It's kind of Google Maps for the blueprint. So without a whole lot of startup time, you can just start clicking through and exploring summaries of blueprint and indicator data that are developed for Huck 12 sub-watersheds and for outer continental shelf lease blocks on the marine side. So these are the two places that I would point you to really cruise around and explore the blueprint spatially.
Hillary, I have a couple other questions that have come in. One of them is the areas that are listed as a high priority. Does the blueprint data tell us what conservation activities are needed for that high priority area?
Yeah, so right now we actually had some really interesting discussions about that in through our workshops, and looked at, are there some ways that we can depict some of these specific actions, restoration versus just protection and pieces. Some of them are fairly implied from the indicators themselves and what condition they're in, but we try to do some more general rules of sort of like, yeah, this is a restoration area, this is, but one of the problems is almost everywhere needs restoration, almost everywhere needs invasive species control, almost everywhere needs. So we've tweaked a little bit, and in the new Simple Viewer, we're actually going to be working on some opportunities that you can look at certain levels of impairment in indicators and filter down the blueprint. So if you're interested in, riparian buffers that are in a certain condition or certain restoration. But in general, we don't have a blanket, kind of this broad action type, and that actually came from a lot of ground truthing of some of the rules that we tried to do. I think that may be something we eventually get to, but not quite there just yet. One other thing, since I won't show you the simple viewer, because some of the older data, is we've also captured comments about those subwatersheds from previous expert workshops along the blueprint process. So sometimes there's additional comments because this is data-driven here, on context and needs around for each of the little subwatersheds as well.
Yeah, so that's a great question, something we're probably going to continue to work toward. And in a lot of ways, you can get at answers to those sorts of questions by overlaying other data sets. So, for example, if you want to look at areas for protection, well, one step might be to overlay the blueprint with existing protected areas from, for example, TNC's Secured Lands database. And obviously, you could exclude those already secured lands and kind of look at the blueprint that's not already protected and think about that as candidates for protection. We also tend to point people toward that medium priority category when they're thinking about restoration opportunities. As Rua said, pretty much everywhere you can make a case for the need for restoration or management. But those medium priority classes in particular, those are places that are in above average indicator condition, so they're pretty good, but they're not the best of the best, and that can be really great areas to work on improving indicator condition and restoring that full ecological function. Were there other questions coming in, Debbie?
Yeah, so another question that came in was that are the priorities based on current ecosystem conditions or a future condition considering climate adaptation or climate change?
The short answer to that is it's current condition. So it's using the current condition of those ecosystem indicators to drive the priority. But when you start thinking about climate adaptation, that gets interesting because we have one of our indicators, the Resilient Biodiversity Hotspots indicator, that's based on data from the Nature Conservancy. Dr. Mark Anderson with TNC has done a lot of work in this idea of conserving the stage in the face of climate change. So the thought being that, well, the actors may change, but the sites that are really important for maintaining biodiversity, those are going to be the same into the future. And so he's done some analysis looking at topographic diversity, kind of the variability in soils and in geologic features, and found that a few different variables can predict an enormous amount of biodiversity. And so we've incorporated that into the blueprint as an indicator, one of our landscapes indicators. And so that's really including in the blueprint these sites that are important for biodiversity now and are going to continue to be important for biodiversity in a changing future. The corridors analysis also helps us capture climate adaptation. Those corridors are connecting coastal and inland areas, thinking about inland migration in response to sea level rise, and the corridors are also connecting places across climate gradients to provide, opportunities for migration. Did you want to add to that, Rua?
Yeah, so a lot of them are, like Hillary said, we're looking at current condition, but most of it is based on these sort of resilience ideas about what are these resilient ecological features that are going to be important as species need to be able to move to more suitable habitat. So not trying to anchor the blueprint onto, this particular species' very unique requirement for right now. And so he mentioned a few of those. There's a few more. Our network complexity, which looks at number of connected stream classes, is on the aquatic side and trying to figure out how to ensure that when certain species habitats become unsuitable, aquatic species are going to be able to move to suitable habitat in the future. So it is current condition right now, but in a more sort of keeping in mind that climate resilience kind of framework and trying to anchor our indicators around things that will matter regardless of how things move into the future.
That's a really good question. Anything else before we keep rolling?
That was it for now.
Awesome. Well, actually, since we were talking about data access, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little demo here. See how we're doing on, yeah, we're good. So what I'm going to do is I'll show, Hillary mentioned our conservation planning atlas here that she mentioned up at the front. We can send out the links. This is salcc.databasin.org. We'll send the link so you don't have to type furiously. So you see here on the right, this is Access Blueprint 2.1 data. So when you click on this piece, what you have is essentially kind of at the very top, download the Blueprint 2.1 data. So what that'll do is it'll give you a big, nice package, include in a geodatabase the indicators, the blueprint, intermediary layers, connectivity, all the different pieces and components if you just want to kind of grab it and work on it in your own machine. And also, you can access any of the individual components. So one of the key things we really wanted to try to do is, in the documentation and the transparency, being able to say, look, let's make sure you've got the intermediate layers, but also enough data that you could pretty much create this from scratch on your own.
If you were crazy enough to want to do that.
Yes, if you were. At least that level, that some people really like to get under the hood and figure out what's going on. So each of these folders has things about, how we defined our ecosystems, each of the different indicators from the ecosystems, all the intermediary scores, the corridors, all kinds of different components here. And so one of the key things within each of these, so we're just talking about the resilient biodiversity hotspots, so that's in this landscapes area. So when you click on any of these layers, and this is all in the rolled up PDF as well, I'll show you real quick the sort of the documentation. So you can also view it in the viewer. So if you click on this little more on the right component, you've got the basic sort of reason for selection. What is this supposed to do? What are the input data? What are all the different mapping steps? Various indicator overview, literature cited. But one thing that we do in our metadata that very rarely you see in metadata is we try to be really make sure we are including known issues with all of our data. So not just the blueprint itself, which has its own sort of known issues, but be explicit about the known issues in each of the individual indicator layers, the habitat, the ecosystem maps, all those different things. So you see here, known issues is not explicitly accounting for threats from sea level rise, did not account for the occurrence and timing of natural disturbances. So essentially what we try to do is and in some cases they're very specific issues that came out in the review process as people are testing and revising these different indicators that we just weren't able to fix in time for the blueprint. So sometimes you'll find things as specific as, the migratory fish index is over-predicting sturgeon north of High Rock Dam in this area of North Carolina. That level of detail sometimes in the known issues. So all of that stuff is documented and rolled into the descriptions of those fields. And so if you see something missing, you have any questions, or as questions come up, we also go back through and then make sure we're kind of adding and refreshing and updating. So these could always be improved, but we try to make sure at least multiple staff members have looked at it, read them. If they're technically correct, but also some people that aren't as technical reading them to make sure that they don't sound like a bunch of jargony gibberish. So that is the documentation that we have for these different layers. So what we'll do is I'm going to show you real quick, just kind of zoom into one spot. And so if we were going to open the blueprint here, you can go ahead and open the blueprint in the top, open it up in a map. Here we open up in a map. And you got your nice little viewer of the blueprint as it loads what you're seeing before. Again, you can download it directly if you want to download it directly from that piece, or we have our different viewers. And here we go. So there you go. It loaded. What I was going to do is actually zoom in on if we're talking about operations and things, zoom in on one of the core properties. So here we've got a nice little locate tool. And the nice thing is, because it's kind of an open source database that we're pulling from, when people can't find their kind of key place in the area, we can actually add our own locations in, and we've actually added a number of locations just because certain wildlife management areas or other things have not showed up. So I looked at Falls Lake, North Carolina. That's one of the reservoirs Core has, kind of got a lot of property around. And so you can zoom right in, find out exactly where you are on this little base map, and look at the blueprint itself. So here's Falls Lake. We're a little bit north of Raleigh. And then from there, you can go ahead and you can add some other layers. So I'm not going to go through all the process of adding a few data sets, but you can add data sets, search from them, add a few different pieces, and then overlay some different layers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shortcut to one that I already made that I added a few different data layers on just to sort of show you. So here we are to orient. Falls Lake Recreation Area is in the middle. So now I'm going to overlay. I'm going to overlay the secured lands. This is sort of Nature Conservancy protected areas, just to give you an idea of the protected. So now you see here in green this whole area around the lake. This is all sort of basically almost all this stuff here is all core property, and you can see the other protected areas around here. So there's your bigger context. And now overlay the blueprint. And one of the things I want to kind of point out as we bring the blueprint on top is a significant amount of high priority areas up around Falls Lake and some of these properties. So this really dark color here now, especially in the east, is kind of the highest priority class. But you also see some variations. Some of those lighter pink areas, some of the sort of different levels of priority. Some may be better for restoration or different actions. Something else is particularly interesting that we see around this area is that a lot of these properties around the lakes and reservoirs are pretty important hubs for connectivity when you get near urban areas. And so this gray area is the corridors. This is going to one of the big state parks and then moving over to the next actual core property over in Jordan Lake. So there are often these key hubs for animal movements, moving between these key hubs, and they also, again, you often have some fairly high priority things. But then there's the question, okay, well, what is so special about some of these? We have some nicer stuff that's a little quicker and easier coming in the simple viewer to really help explore some of that. But I'll show you, Hillary mentioned the resilient biodiversity hotspots. So I have that queued up, and we can overlay that onto this this particular map. And then you'll be able to see which of those areas are higher or lower. So remember the resilient biodiversity hotspots. These are areas, particularly because of the sort of diversity of the landforms and sort of the local connectivity around there. These are areas that are important now for biodiversity, especially some of these kind of rare plants and animals and critters, but are also likely to be really important in the face of climate change. It's actually pretty amazing the relationship between these and the current biodiversity patterns we have. So this dark brown area, this is actually some of the highest resilience scores up in this section. So this is that eastern part that was high priority earlier. And so you have a lot of these things that are really kind of basically climate resilient hotspots in this sort of eastern part of Falls Lake. So I'll pull that off again so you can sort of see these two. And so this is, again, as we're kind of exploring the indicators, and so you think about, this is a feature for a lot of key plants now and into the future. And so, if we're thinking about invasive species control or other particular measurements of sort of management restoration, these places might be good spots within the larger Falls Lake area to target for some of those restoration activities, given their importance for biodiversity now and into the future. We can also look at, I mentioned also we have some of the cultural components as well. So one of the things that comes out fairly high with a lot of the core properties, at least the things that I was looking at, was in our urban open space index. So now we're talking about the sort of potential value for that urban open space for citizens. Let me pull this off. So now what we have here is the Urban Open Space Index, and this dark green here, which is pretty much covering the core, is kind of already protected areas that's nearby with easy access for the urban population. So of course, I think I heard the statistic that's like the core properties are the most visited protected lands in the entire U.S. And so this really highlights into some of these dark areas the importance of some of those protected areas for urban open space. So that's actually another component and reason why some of these areas are high priority, is because of their role in urban open space as well. And that becomes increasingly important as we mentioned we have some of these threats. I'm going to put on the urban growth model that's available that we've used in some of the planning here. And so we'll look at the probability of urbanization. This is like 2100. And so dark black is already urbanized right now, and the red is probability of urbanization. So as you get lighter in the red, lower probability by 2100. So in this particular model, which we have for the whole area, you can go in and you can click, well, I'm only interested in looking at 2030 or 2060, and so you have options for which time zones you're going to be able to look at. We're really close to some improved urban growth models that incorporate this is a business as usual. We've got some improved ones that are very close to release that also incorporate different smart growth practices and what would it look like under different growth practices, and also under different levels of blueprint adoption as well. So we're going to be working on, we'll have some improved urban growth. So that's just a quick tour, just zooming into one spot, showing you a few of the various layers and how to grab a hold of them. So maybe if we want to stop here real quick for questions, and then we'll go back to the close it out.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I hope folks can see the reason I wanted the folks from the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative to present was they have a lot of data out there, a lot of data that can help us in planning projects, in planning or doing recreation plans or shoreline management plans. They have a lot of information and data out there that can help us make our case for our projects even better. And in the spirit of trying to utilize data that's already out there, I wanted to make sure folks knew that this data existed and was available. And so I'm so happy to see a lot of folks on the line and hope that you can take advantage of the information that they've already collected. If there's any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or are you guys about done with your presentation, Hillary?
That maybe 5 more slides just to talk a little bit about future directions and how folks have been using the blueprint so far. But definitely want this to be very conversational, so if you want to seize the moment and ask any questions about what we've talked about so far, please do.
Yeah, the one thing you'll probably see from, and Terry mentioned a little bit, is that one of the differences about sort of the blueprint and these data is that we actually have staff and a strong commitment to help people that want to use these resources. So if you're just listening on the line and they're just like, oh yeah, hey, I might want to go try this out. We're glad to kind of help you out and always learn and improve some of the interfaces and help answer sort of questions and help you out if you've got a specific use for the blueprint.
Yep.
Right, I don't see any more questions at this point, so I suggest, Hillary, you go ahead and finish your slides, and then I'll unmute all the lines at the end so that people can maybe have a conversation if they need to. Okay?
Sounds great. So we've talked about who we are at the South Atlantic LCC and what we do, and I also want to touch briefly on how we do it because it's a little bit unique. We're very committed to this lean startup process, which is something we've borrowed from kind of the tech startup world, the Googles and the Facebooks. And the idea here is that it's actually a lot like adaptive management. You create something, you test how well it's working, you learn from the results of that testing, and you use that learning to inform another trip through this loop. But the twist is, with Lean Startup, you're trying to get through that loop as fast as possible, minimizing your investment of time and resources. So instead of trying to develop the perfect plan or the perfect product up front, instead you develop a minimum viable product, the smallest, cheapest possible version of a product that you can to facilitate learning. So we often think of this as adaptive management on steroids, as my colleague Louise has coined. And so I emphasize this just to say that we're constantly in a state of revision, either for the blueprint, for the indicators, for the interfaces themselves. And so this is why feedback from the broader cooperative community, from you all on the phone, is so, so important to what your cooperative is able to accomplish. So that's really the way that we've made Lean Startup our own here at the South Atlantic LCC, is working with our cooperative at every stage. Y'all are our product testers, you're our expert revisers, you're our end users, and we really take your feedback very seriously when we're developing the next version of the blueprint, the next version of an indicator, or as Ruth said, when we're testing out new features in the simple viewer interface. So just to give you a quick sense of where we're going in the short-term future, we're working on building a better blueprint. We're not going to stop here with 2.1. Next year, we're planning to release a small update to the blueprint that's going to incorporate some new and improved indicator data for a small number of indicators that have new data available. We'll do an updated connectivity analysis. And we're also continuing to work on linking conservation actions to outcomes in the indicators. And this is something that was really, really important for that Department of Interior Wildland Fire Resilient Landscapes funding that I talked about, where the South Atlantic indicators are actually able to serve as the tracking mechanism for reporting on return on investment. So being able to say more than we use this money to burn X number of acres, but being able to say as a result of this burning, we have improved the integrity of the pine and prairie system by this %. We even created this much of an increase in pine and prairie bird habitat. So we're continuing to work on developing those linkages between actions and indicators, not just for prescribed burning, but for things like land acquisition too. So that'll be a continued emphasis going forward. And we're also working on improving the interfaces, so not just the underlying science, but the interfaces, making it easy to use and intuitive. So we'll be working on some new features in the Simple Viewer and continuing to work on that design. And one of the last things I wanted to touch on came up a little bit earlier about different LCCs developing different spatial plans. So this is an effort called the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. It's being spearheaded by the directors of the state fish and wildlife agencies and several different federal agencies that work on natural resources. The idea here, a key outcome of SeaCast, is going to be an integrated blueprint for the whole Southeast that seams together all of the different spatial priorities that are coming out of the different LCCs in the Southeast. So we'll be joining up on the South Atlantic Appalachian boundary, on the South Atlantic Peninsular Florida boundary to create this seamless blueprint. And the first version of that blueprint, it won't be perfect, but it's looking pretty good so far, is going to be coming out in October of this year at the SeaCast conference in Baton Rouge. So just wanted to preview that there will be a blueprint that crosses these LCC boundaries very soon, and that'll be something that we continue to work on. So last thing, as a user support person, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, is how people are using the blueprint to inform conservation action and investment. And if you're interested in reading more stories like this, I'd point you to the Who's Using the Blueprint part of the Blueprint web page. On the South Atlantic LCC website, there's the link there. We have a bunch of different profiles. One I want to talk about is Anna Smith, who works for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and she's had a lot of success using the blueprint to bring in grant funding. So far, she's brought in more than $2 million to conserve coastal and riparian habitat in South Carolina through the Coastal Wetlands Grant Program and the Forest Legacy Grant Program. This is showing some pictures of South Fenwick Island that she was able to support the protection through this grant program and use the blueprint to help support the importance of this area for protection. The blueprint's also being used to inform public lands planning, both with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service. Pam Wingrove is a natural resources planner with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and she's been using the blueprint to help inform and prioritize areas for land protection and thinking about how best to link up various eastern North Carolina refuges in the face of climate change. And Mary Morrison is with the Francis Marion National Forest and has used the blueprint to help predict how the forest is likely to be impacted by climate change and urbanization, and to help communicate at public meetings around the National Forest Plan revision the importance of the Francis Marion within the larger landscape. And we also have a pretty cool story about how the blueprint's being used by private industry, but unfortunately we're not able to talk about it. It's top secret. We've been sworn to secrecy, but we're excited that the blueprint's being used by private industry folks as well. So last slide, I always want to leave folks with an idea of how to get more involved. If you're interested, I'd really encourage you to join the South Atlantic LCC web community. That's our web address there. If you sign up and create an account on our website, that'll get you added to our email list. You'll get a once monthly newsletter to help keep you up to date with what's going on in your cooperative, and that's where you'll see opportunities to join teams, for example. It's how you get notified of new versions of the blueprint. You're also, of course, welcome to connect with staff. That's why we're here. We're here to support you. So please reach out if you think that this could be useful to you. We'd love to talk to you more about how you envision using the blueprint, and talk to other members of the cooperative, folks like Debbie, who can tell you a little bit more about what's going on in the South Atlantic LCC. And then obviously please explore the blueprint. That's the web page for the blueprint website. Which will get you links to the Conservation Planning Atlas, links to the Simple Viewer, and some more information about how the blueprint was developed. So here's contact information for me and for RUA. We would love to hear from you, and definitely have 15 more minutes for questions and discussion. So Debbie, if you wanted to unmute everybody, we can have a Q&A and discussion here.
Sure, I will sure do that in just a minute. I also wanted to let folks know that Mr. Lee and myself are planning to attend the SeaCast meeting in October in Baton Rouge, and I will probably be providing a summary of that out to at least the environmental chiefs in each of the districts. And we'll try to copy Ryan and Mike Montone in our operations and regulatory sections here at the division so that they can send that out to their folks as well. So let me go ahead and unmute the phones. Make sure that I do this without hanging up on everybody.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
So if you have any questions that were just too long to type in and you'd like to ask them, please go ahead and ask any questions you have.
Hey, this is Ryan. It's not a question as much as a statement or just thought for ponderance here, but you know, as active land managers out there, we're constantly looking for conservation packages that we can get our land managers involved with that tie into a bigger picture like this. I'm excited to be getting involved with this and part of this. Happy to help out how we can. I'm thinking a little bit more conversation into a little bit more specifics on some of our land management policies and practices with this group might be helpful, and I'd like to try to facilitate that somehow.
Awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. We're always trying to...
I'll definitely work with Hillary and Rua and Mallory to see if we can't set up a time for them to sit down with us, either over the phone or hopefully in person. I know, Ryan, you travel quite a bit, so we'll have to see if you're ending up their way and if we can get up to meet with them. You guys are in Raleigh, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's where the staff is based. Where are you based, Ryan, when you're not on the road?
I'm actually on the road right now, but I'm based out of Atlanta, downtown. However, as you had shown Falls Lake up on the screen there, Falls and Jordan both are, you know, core involved, core managed areas, and I can certainly find, you know, double duty, double reason to head up that way at some point.
Well, and chances are we could find a reason to be in Atlanta too. So it's just a direct flight, 6-hour drive, not too bad. So definitely let's follow up and see where to go from here.
Sure. I didn't want to be in India and make you come to Atlanta, but we'll figure something out.
Yeah, we actually end up getting in Atlanta pretty...
Yeah, it's with some frequency. So yeah.
Good. Okay, good. We'll be in touch. I'm marking your email addresses down right now, and I'm gonna.
Beautiful.
Shoot them.
Any other questions?
Can we get a copy of the presentation?
Sure.
This is Nathan.
Well, I'll plan to email a link to these slides to Debbie. You think you can take it from there, Debbie?
Yes, I will do so.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, if there are no other questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. No. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here and then get ready to end the conference.